Hello and welcome to another edition of Proselytize or Apostatize. I'm the host, David Russell, along with my co-host, David Paulman. What's up, David?
How are you doing, Russell?
I'm good, man. What you been up to, man?
Working on Romans 9 ceaselessly. Finally got my commentary out on that today, so yeah.
Yeah, man. I saw that, man. I haven't had a chance to watch it yet, but I'm kind of excited. I know Stephen isn't, but... Right on. Yeah, man, we've been having a contract shift and transition, so it's been like crazy at work, so I haven't been able to do much reading or anything, but yeah, we got a scholarly debate today, don't we?
Yes, we do. Yeah, obviously, you know, we've had one King James only debate on here, and so we're going at it again. But yeah, this one's going to get pretty deep because we're hitting some specifics in that debate. So yeah.
So what are we hitting, man? Tell me about it.
All right, so we got a passage in, is it Mark, the first one that you're going after, or is that the one in John? Because I don't know how we switched that up. Did you finally agree on that one, Stephen?
We're going to be covering the Pericope Adulterae in John 7, so 53 through 8:11, and then Nick's book has covered Revelation 16:5, specifically
That's
from his edition.
Right on. Yeah, that was our special guest, Stephen Boyce. Hey, Stephen, how you been since the last time I saw you?
I'm surviving, David.
Surviving. Nice. Well, David, I'm gonna hand it over to you, man, and let you get started on this so you can introduce the topic and our guests.
Yeah, sure. So first, let me introduce Nick Sayers. I know he studies this topic quite extensively. I've seen him on, I believe it was Modern Day Debate was where I first saw him debating the topic. So how are you doing, Nick?
Yeah, good, thanks. Yeah, going well.
Great to have you on with us. And then, of course, returning for the second time, Stephen Boyce. How are you doing, Stephen?
Doing good, David.
All right, so we're just going to dive into the debate then. So we got, 10-minute opening statements. Obviously, Stephen, you've been through this before. We're going to be letting Nick go first because he's presenting the affirmative here. Like I said, we're covering two specific passages here in John and in Revelation. So, try to follow along with that. We're going to split it 50-50 when we get to the like the back and forth period. So we're just going to let that be easier to follow there, but at first it might be a little more mixed up when we're doing opening statements. So yeah, just try to follow along there. But yeah, Nick, you got a 10-minute opening statement.
Okay, so I believe that the Pericope Adulterae should be kept in the Bible, and so I get labelled as a King James onlyist. It just seems like a label that doesn't seem to matter if you fight against this. I've got a site called texasreceptus.com. I've been involved in Bible translation into Urdu. I've also actually updated the King James in the King James Version 2016 edition, but I still get called a King James onlyist, and it's just this label that you get stuck with, and I don't really care anymore. People can call me whatever they want, and I just say, hey, yeah, I'm King James only, whatever, whether they think I'm a Gippite, a Ruckmanite, or whatever, that's fine. But I believe the Pericope Adulterae should be kept in our Bibles, in modern versions. I believe that what is represented in the King James Version and the underlying Greek text, the Textus Receptus, is accurate and are the words of God and are from John. And so there's also another verse in the Bible, another area in the Bible in the last 12 verses of Mark that has about the same number of verses or same number of words missing. It has exactly 12 verses missing, and some people hyphen that and say, it shouldn't be we shouldn't say omitted or deleted or missing. But there's only two Greek manuscripts that don't have the last 12 verses of Mark. So you're looking at 99% of all the manuscripts have it, and only two don't, Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. And to me, it's the absolute slam dunk that the last 12 verses of Mark, they should be there. They've been accepted by the church. They're in pretty much everything except for Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. But in this case of the Pericope Adulterae, we're looking at the ratio being about 85% of manuscripts have it, and 15% don't. Now, how can this be explained, that there's 15% that sort of that omit this passage? Well, there's a thing called a lectern cycle. And so this is a concept brought up by scholars such as Maurice Robinson, David Black, or James Snap Jr. Now, I believe this explains why these 12 verses are omitted in the early manuscripts. And this is because the Pericope Adulterae is a unique type of story. And it was an interruption. The scribes interrupted what Jesus was doing, threw this woman down at his feet, and this interrupted the normal narrative. And so I believe that what happened was when the early lectern cycle was happening, which I guess it's like having a Christmas story. Imagine in the middle of a Christmas story, we've got the woman caught in adultery story. It just stood out. And so what they did is they actually put marks on the manuscripts to point to skip this story and to do it at a later date. And they actually had a day where they focused on that story, but they didn't want to focus on it at that time. So I believe that these marks became mistaken, just like today, Bruce Metzger says these marks are omission marks, but they're actually not. These are for the lectern cycle, for people who are reading these verses to just skip the woman in adultery and go to John chapter 8, verse 12. And so to me, this explains everything, because the early scribes who were copying manuscripts, they thought that these marginal notes meant to actually leave this part out. And so some people left that out. But what we see later on is people then were trying to put it back in and things like that. And so that, to me, thoroughly explains why there's 15% of the manuscripts different. When we look at the evidence, unfortunately, people like James White, Dan Wallace, they're not looking at the lectern cycles. And I believe that this is the silver bullet against the concepts that come originally from Tregelles and go through Hort and then parroted by Metzger. I believe that the lectern cycle concept is the silver bullet that that shows why these were omitted, and then pretty much everything else is a side issue. Once you get that main issue sorted out, and once you understand that there are even marginal notes that say that the lectern cycle took that part out, or they were putting the verse back in and explaining that it was because of the lectern cycle. So I think that's something that really needs to be discussed and addressed. And so I guess that would be I guess I've got 5 minutes to talk about the Pericope Adulterae, then 5 minutes to talk about the Revelation 16:5. So there is a verse in Revelation 16:5 that basically says, I'll get it actually verbatim because I'm known to paraphrase things wrongly. So in the King James, it says, and I heard the angel of the waters say, Thou art righteous, O Lord, which art and wast and shalt be, because thou hast judged thus. Now, the words which art and wast and shalt be are actually a name. It's called a noun phrase. Now, this is actually an expansion of the name of Jehovah. Jehovah is made up of a Hebrew word hava, which means to be or to exist. It's very closely related to I am. The name I am and Jehovah are very closely linked. So when in the temple, whenever they said the name Jehovah, the priests in the temple would say, which art and wast and shalt be. And so this is this exact phrase. And so this would be the expansion of the name of Jehovah. And so this is the most holiest name in the whole entire New Testament, apart from probably Jesus saying, I am. And so what I believe happened was early scribes saw this, when you go through issues like the Old Testament, when you have the Tetragrammaton, many times the name is substituted. They might put God over it, or Adonai. The Jews won't even say the name, and so they'll substitute it. And I believe that's what's happened here. That the last third of that noun phrase, which says "which art and wast and shalt be," that last part of it, they wrote "holy" over it. Now, the word "holy" means sacred. So we have the concept of nomina sacra. So this is a noun phrase. It's a name. It has its own Strong's number. That whole phrase has its own Strong's number. It's a noun phrase, so it's nomina, and it's holy. It's sacra, or hosios, holy. So they wrote "holy" over that last part of the name to show people that you can't just say this name whenever you want. A bit like what's happened in the Old Testament, where the Tetragrammaton, they tended to cover up that name so people weren't saying it at the wrong time. And it goes back to the commandment, don't take the name of the Lord, which is Jehovah, the name of the Lord in vain. So people were worried about saying it at the wrong place or wrong time, or you can only say that in the temple or whatever. And so with writing "holy" over the last part of that name, that's just gone into the transmission of the New Testament. But I believe the early Greek church understood that, but it's just been translated. And Theodore Beza, he understood this concept back in 1882, and he put it into his Greek and Latin New Testament, and it's been adopted into the King James and into many other Bibles since then. And so I'm not sure how much time I've got left, but
got about a minute.
Got about a minute. Okay. And so what we find is everywhere in the book of Revelation where someone is a heavenly being, like an angel or even Jesus, where they say the name Lord, which would be in Greek Kyrios, but in Hebrew it would be Jehovah, then only like a few words later it says "which was and is to come." So it appears 5 times in the book of Revelation. So every time that Kyrios is mentioned, then it says "which was and is to come." Now, the final form of that is in Revelation 16:5, when an angel says it. It says Kyrios, which is actually omitted in the critical text, but it says "which was and is and shall be." So that's the purest form of the triadic declaration. The other 4 say "is to come," which is not exactly like "it shall be." It doesn't exactly match the name of Jehovah, N-I-M, but it's very, very close. And so that's why this is the most holiest name in the New Testament.
Very good. Very good. All right. Thank you for that, Nick. And Stephen, we're going to let you go into your 10-minute opening statement.
All right. Well, I'm Stephen Boyce. Let me give you a little bit. Let me give a shout out to Nick real quick. I actually read his book he provided for me, and I think Nick did a tremendous job of the Nomina Sacra. Actually, that was probably one of the best and most thorough explanations I've seen from Old Testament to New Testament that I've ever read, and how scribes in the Hebrew and in the Greek would actually insert it. Now, I would disagree with your final approach to it, Nick, but I actually want to give you a shout out and said you did a great job on that. I appreciate the work you put into that. Let me give you a background too. I grew up in a TR my whole life. In fact, Nick, you'd be proud to know half my family is probably pulling for you right now. I grew up TR, King James, the whole way. It wasn't until the last few, maybe 5 to 7 years, I began to change. I moved over more to a majority text before I actually became the position I am in critical text now. But my background has not always been, this is who I am, but this is the way I grew up. It's actually, I grew up on the other side of it. And so what I do is I want to make sure I always appreciate people on both sides, because we have brothers and sisters who are on both sides of the issue. And I want to make sure that we always see that. I have family members I got to get along with at holidays because of this very thing. So I think we're all going to spend eternity together because we love the Lord and we follow him and put our trust in him. So we might as well learn to get along even in disagreement in this world. But my background is definitely TR, and I wanted to make a quick statement that I am not anti-Bible. I'm not a liberal. I believe in inspiration. I believe in inerrancy. Many of my friends jumped off the inerrancy side of the train, and I'm still on the train. I believe in inerrancy. I know there's ways that people identify and translate what that means differently than I would, so I want to be careful. I know terms can get twisted. In a context, I still defend inerrancy. I defend the scripture. I work as a research and apologetics ministry for a church plant in Seattle, Washington, City Light, Seattle. I do a lot of writing. In fact, most of my work is in the canon. I do work in textual criticism. I'm almost done with my PhD that focuses and concentrates on canonicity and textual criticism. But a lot of the writing that I've done thus far has been on the canon. But this stuff is important too. And I think we need to have these discussions. I think we need to put it out there. But let me jump into, I'm going to start in Revelation 16:5, and then I will present my position of the Pericope Adulterae at the end. Here's the thing about Revelation 16:5, and I've read Nick and I've watched some of Nick's statements about it, including his discussions with Dr. James White and so forth. When we're talking about the TR tradition, this is something I did not understand when I was a TR. There is not one TR. And I know that Nick believes that. He obviously talks about numerous editions of the TR. Before Scribner, by the time we get into 1516 with Erasmus, all the way to 1707 with Mill's text, we have right under 200 years of a tradition. Updates, changes, and so forth. And I'd like to believe that Nick would agree that no two TRs read identical in every single place. But there's a tradition before Scribner, and I know Scribner is a part of the tradition, but a lot of what Scribner did is he put Greek readings into a text on the basis of how the King James translators chose between Stephanus, Erasmus, and Beza. But when we look at this tradition of the TR, for almost 200 years, there was a change made in 1582, which is what Nick is referring to. The Hagios there, the Holy One, was changed by Beza, and he mentions why in his annotations, which we'll look into and probably discuss more, in 1582, and he kept that tradition all the way to his 1598. So in 1604, the King James translators, looking at the different editions of the TRs, if you would, the most updated would have been obviously Beza's work. And they chose to go with Theodore Beza's reading here. The interesting thing about that is I happen to believe that if the King James translators would have chose Stephanus in that place over Beza, that this debate wouldn't even be happening. I think the main reason, maybe not with Nick, but with most, I don't think this debate would happen. I think most of it's happening because it's been kept a tradition through the English translation because of the King James translators. That's my personal opinion. An interesting thing about this tradition, it was short-lived. Out of the 200 years of the TR, the reading Esamenos, which is to be, was actually changed later on in the other editions of the TR. In fact, Beza died, I believe, is in October of 1605, I believe it was. And his editors put together another edition named after him in guess what year? 1611. And in that edition, his own editors actually changed the reading back to Hagios. They did not keep Esamenos in the 1611. So the last edition of Beza, granted he was dead, but his editors clearly did not agree with the change that was made. In 1624, you have the Elzevir nephew and uncle who put together two big time Greek texts. There was other editions that were changed, but the main ones were 1624, and the big one was 1633. And the reason for that is because in 1633, they gave it its official name, the Textus Receptus, the received text by all. But in 1624, they also did not have Beza's reading. They would have aligned themselves more with the Stephanus reading. But in 1633, Elzevir changed it back to Esamenos to fit Beza's reading. But then in 1707, there was a man by the name of Mills who also has an edition of the TR. He changed it back to Holy One, Hagios. He did not go with Beza's edition there. So my point in that is within that, there's really only a 30-year tradition, maybe a few additional years because of Elzevir 1633. Most of the time we talk about, well, this is the received text, the text that's been received by all. But out of those 200 years, really less than 40 years of it was actually accepting the reading that is a Somenos. Most TR traditional years of acceptance before Beza and after Beza accepted the reading, not just a Somenos for that short time, but most of the time it was actually Hasios. I would say that, to me, this reading came in because of something that's been called a conjectural emendation that Beza did in his 1582. Now, I don't think it's a conjectural emendation to the fullest extent, as some would say. To me, actually, based on what he said, I think he was actually harmonizing the text more than conjecturing. I think he looked at the other four usages, as Nick talked about in the book of Revelation, chapter 1, chapter 4, chapter 11, and he harmonized it to fit the way it read in the previous four. And at the end of his annotation, both in his 1598 and in his 1582, he stated at the very bottom that basically he not only did it on the basis of harmonization, but hermeneutically understanding the passage. So he concreted his decision by saying, well, this is what's happening contextually, so I'm going to keep my statement because it contextually makes sense on the basis of hermeneutics. So I think that this decision was made not in the overall tradition of the Greek manuscripts, even in the TR traditions. Most years of the TR tradition did not have this reading. Even after Beza, some of the editors went back to Hasios instead of Asamenos. So I'll leave that there for that section. I'm going to talk about the PA a little bit, the Pericope Adulterae. I wrote an entire article on this, and I only have a few minutes, so I'll try to go quick. I want to say I do believe that the story of the Pericope Adulterae is a true story that happened in history. In fact, if you've read my article, I stated as such. I do believe it's a true story. The question that I asked in the article is, did John write the story of the Pericope Adulterae? I demonstrated through external manuscripts as well as through ancient translations that it is not a part of the textual tradition. The thing that I found that I did when I was in the TR movement is I always looked back and I started with the last 400 years of church history. That's how I started my base. We look at the King James, we look at the TRs, that's where we start our evidence. As I moved to the critical text position over time, I recognized the necessity of starting a textual understanding of original readings is not from the last 400 years, but from the first 400 years. What did the church have in the first 400 years of manuscripts? What Bible were they reading? Did they have the Pericope Adulterae? Based on the earliest witnesses and evidence, they did not have it in their manuscripts, which we will get into more later. Also, it's not in the ancient languages, the ancient translations, the Sahidic and so forth of the Coptic language. It is not in those earliest witnesses either. Church fathers quoted it. Patristic writers wrote about it. But oftentimes, as I demonstrated in my article, it was not on the basis of them citing the Gospel of John specifically. Most of the time it was other words, and they didn't even identify it. Sometimes it was Papias who quoted it, but quoted it through the writings of Eusebius, quoting him as stating that it was actually in another gospel called the Gospel of the Hebrews, which is not a canonical book. It is not a heretical one, but it is not a canonical book. But its story came there. I also showed, and I know my time's wrapped up here, how many of those terms that are in the story are not Johannine. I gave examples in my article where there's words in that passage that are not John-like, but there's actually many Lucan terminology. The syntax is more Lucan than it is Johannine, and that actually has got a better case to be made for Luke to have possibly read it. And I confirm and believe with Kyle Hughes that perhaps it is a part of one of Luke's special materials and study materials when he was compiling the Gospel of Luke. I do believe it's a true story, not in the fullest sense, but I do believe it is a true story that survived in antiquity, that we should appreciate and talk about and even note in the variant sections, and that it is a wonderful story about Jesus. But I do not believe John wrote the story himself.
All right. Thank you for that, Stephen. All right. So now we're going to move into rebuttals. First, we'll give it to you, Nick. You got a 5-minute rebuttal, sir.
Okay. So I guess I'll go 2.5 minutes on the Revelation 16:5 issue. And so I think when you look at the Elzeva editions, the 1624 omits it because they were mostly just doing a rerun of the 1550 of Stephanus. So then after a few years, you're looking at, I think 9 years later, they added the reading of Beza. And so that they weren't, in a sense, purposely going out to omit it in their first edition. I think they were just looking at the most popular TR edition, 1550, and then they printed that, and then they were updating those things as Beza had done. And so when you look at Mills, the 1707 of Mills, he actually only just worked on the 1550 of Stephanus. So that's why it has those readings in there. So I'm not sure about the 1611 text of Beza, but I know that Theodore Beza was the main guy behind the Geneva Bible. And so perhaps it is an edition of the Geneva Bible, which wouldn't have had that reading. But we can see things like even in Erasmus's annotations, he said the reading should be the one who was and is to come. And so we look at people like Elias Hutter. He did a 12-language dodecaglot, and that in that he has the exact reading of Beza, but he also has the reading of Erasmus. So this was questioned in that time, and so I don't think that there was just this 30 or 40 years of Esomenos. I believe that, just like the King James has lasted for many, many years, I believe that these editions of the TR, some scholars, of course, have printed other editions. And when you get to pre-Luckman, many of these people were not favourable to the Textus Receptus. And so they were just picking sort of, the 1550 just became very popular. But I believe that the 1598 is the closest that we have in print of that era, but the Textus Scrivener is probably the closest that we have to the text underlying the King James. So when we look at the Pericope Adulterae, I'm not sure how much time I've got left here, but
got about 2.5 minutes.
2.5 minutes. Okay. So this is the sequence that it has to go in for everything in your article to work out fine. Luke has to write a rough draft called Proto-Luke or L-Source, which is non-existent. There are two stories floating around from two different sources after a while. Then someone rewrote them and conflated them together. Then someone added extra introductory material and wanted to teach us that Jesus was literate. Then someone put it into the Gospel of John, right smack bang into the very popular passage that they read annually at Pentecost. So everyone would have known this. It's a bit like a Christmas narrative or a nativity scene, just plonking a 12-verse story right in the middle of that. Most of the churches accepted it, and 85% of the manuscripts now have it. So the churches accepted it. But then it somehow floated into Luke 21, John 7:36, and other places, which are, they're my thing is that they're pointed to by the lectern notes. But your concept is that this then floated into these other places and sort of settled. So you've got to have all those things in order, which, if you take one or two of them out, it seems to crumble, especially the thing that I mentioned with the lectern cycle. Or my proposal is the Pericope Adulterae was written by John. It was omitted because of the lectern cycle notes being mistaken as omission notes, and this was copied by later scribes. So my view is very simplified and easy to take in, where I believe, Stephen, that your view is very complicated. It involves lots of different factors, and if one or two of those factors are taken out, then the whole thing collapses.
All right.
Hey, David,
Stephen, then.
Before I start my time, can I ask something for clarification?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Nick, are you defending the 1598 of Beza? Is that right?
No, I defend the underlying Greek text of the King James Version. So I believe the King James translators, they worked on their own Greek text, but it was never published. And that's exactly what Westcott and Hort and Scrivener they produced in 1881, or they attempted to reproduce that. So it was accepted by Westcott and Hort and Scribner that there was an underlying Greek text that was different to all the other TRs.
Now, let me ask you this as well, real quick. You're basing on this Trident declaration is to come on the basis of the word Jehovah, correct? Being in the text. Kurie. Okay. I just wanted to clarify. I apologize. I want to make sure I understood you, misrepresented you.
Both Jehovah and I am. So part of the name Jehovah is Hova, which actually means to be or to exist. If you were to expand that out, it would be past, present, and future. Or in the present, it's I am. So the name's Jehovah. Specifically in Revelation 16, it's 5. It's on the basis of Kurie, being the Jehovah, or Lord being there. Yes, because I believe John would have spoke Hebrew, and he would have spoken to Jesus and the angels in Hebrew in his vision of Revelation. So they would have said Jehovah. Okay, perfect. David, I'm going to try to screen share when I start my time. You're going to have to tell me if this works, because technology hates me some days, loves me. I have a love-hate relationship with technology. So you will actually have to tell me if this works. If you can see my screen.
I can see it.
Okay. This is the note at 1582, the annotations of, and you can go ahead and start my time on this. This is the note of the 1582 where he explains why he made the change in the text. John sets forth the name Jehovah, which is exactly what Nick is talking about, in all other places, as we have certainly stated in chapter 1, verse 4, and then he lists the others later. He has the statement that normally the third tense is followed with this fourth one, kai ha erkamenos, which is used in 1, also in chapter 4, chapter 11. That term is used. And then he says, why then this reading in this place later? He's trying to figure out, why is hasios here? It is therefore not possible to doubt what the genuine reading, which is restored to the book, from the older and good, faithful manuscripts. Certainly, Asamenos, which is who will be, or the one that should come. The true reason that this is not written Erkamenos, the one who is to come, as it is previous in the last 4 locations, and he reads those 4 locations, which Nick has referred to, then he gives his hermeneutical understanding, because Christ as the judge, he is seated on the tribunal and arrives at the decree of judgment. Now, I take issue with this on Beza's statement. So he admits earlier there's really not any documented evidence for what he's doing. So he's reasoning with himself. He asks, why is this reading in this place later? Why is hasios here and not? I want to make the argument that none of this really matters. Because the word Jehovah should not be in the text to begin with. In fact, I was surprised when I looked up Kurie, there is 0 Greek manuscripts pre-16th that even have the word Lord in this passage of Scripture. In fact, I want to bring up Brill's volume for you as well. Brill says this, I backtracked where the word came into the tradition. It says that Erasmus translated the late Vulgate, not the early, this is later Latin, into Greek here as Codex 2814, and all other pre-16th century manuscripts omit the word despite the absence of Greek manuscript support. Kurie remained in the Textus Receptus. So there are 0 Greek manuscripts that actually even have the word Lord there. So here's Beza making an argument on the fact that, well, the word Lord's here, so this has to fit the other 4. Kurie is here. The word Lord is here. We have to have this tridact declaration, the one who was and is to come, because of the holy sacred name. Well, I would argue that holy sacred name is not even supported in this text. It came from a Latin conjectural emendation that was listed as well by Brown and others, that Erasmus actually put this in through the Latin, not the Greek. In fact, he lists here, Brill lists here, the 2814th manuscript, which I will pull up for you, the manuscript that Erasmus would have been using in 1516, and I will show you in the Greek how this is the case. Dikaios right here, where my arrow is, that is the word righteous. And in the text, it says in the King James, you are righteous, O Lord, righteous, O Lord. Right here in this spot should have had Kurie, and it does not. It moves on to I, Hos. Have the word Lord even in the mandate of Erasmus. I would say that Erasmus, because of what we just saw in Brill, he actually included a reading from the Latin with no Greek support at all. And to me, I don't even, and so Beza comes along and reads this, and he's like, whoa, wait a minute, we're missing something here. And I'm going to stop sharing and come back to my screen here. Again, I'm not good at technology. Can you see me?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay, I'm not good at technology. But here's Beza that says, wait a minute, this word should be followed with this 3. And in the 3, one of them's missing, and it's been replaced with hasios. Now, Nick has represented the fact that hasios was placed usually over asomenos, the last word of the phrase, kind of collectively bringing all of 3 together as the one sacred name. I don't see that in any of the other 4 locations. In fact, I'd like to see a manuscript that has hasios sitting over there in chapter 1 or chapter 4 or chapter 11. I don't see any manuscripts at all that even have this 3 lines of was, is, and is to come, and then hasios over it. There's no evidence in any manuscript. And then there's no manuscripts that have the word kurie in Greek anyway. This was a decision. So we have a conjectural emendation in 1516 by Erasmus that was followed into the tradition to Beza in 1582. He reads this word, says he reads this word and realizes, man, this doesn't sound right. We need to harmonize it. It needs to be there because Jehovah is there. So he harmonizes it, and then he says, well, the tribunal throne is here too. He begins to reign, so therefore we have to concrete this down because, hey, even contextually, it makes sense to have this here. So he did it on harmonization, and he also did it on hermeneutics.
All right, very interesting. We are definitely getting into it now. Let's begin this kind of cross-examination. This section's a little more informal, so it's just kind of you get to dialogue. I'm going to let Nick lead first, though, and I think we'll start off with talking about with John there, Pericope there, because that's I think where Nick started off in his opening statement. So yeah, we'll begin there. Take half of this time to just kind of discuss that. Nick, you can begin leading that with whatever questions or objections you have for Stephen.
Cool. So I've got about 10 minutes or 5 minutes.
This section's kind of informal. This is just kind of conversation between the two of you. So I'll let you talk it out.
So I was Stephen. I was just going through another article you wrote about the Gospel of Thomas.
Yeah.
And I enjoyed it. I thought it was very good and accurate. But there were 3 criteria that you had there for something to be included into the Gospels. And yes. I'll just quickly read those 3. It's firstly, it must have divine attributes within its pages. But you mentioned in the Pericope Adulterae article that everything about the story looks and sounds like Jesus. Secondly, it must be traced back to the apostles, and you actually do trace this back to Luke, to an apostle. Then thirdly, it must be corporately received by the church as a whole.
Sure.
And so, and I believe that, obviously there was some early hiccups in that I believe are explained by the Lecton cycle, but 85% of the manuscripts have it, and even in modern times, they've tried to omit this verse. And the churches, like in 1946, the Revised Standard Version, they tried to omit it, and there was a lot of pressure to put it back in, and they put it back in to the main text. And so it seems like the church wants it in there. So these 3 criteria that you mentioned about something being worthy of canonicity in your other article, that to me they apply by the standards that you've revealed in your article.
Yeah, I think those things are important, but they don't guarantee canonicity. In fact, I even stated in there that I think it's a true story. I think there's a lot of true stories. And I mentioned the verse in John chapter, I believe it's 21, where he said that many things were done by Jesus, said and done by Jesus, that the libraries of the world cannot contain. I happen to believe a lot of those survived. To be canon, they need to meet that criteria. But just because something makes that criteria doesn't automatically, well, that's canon. I do not confirm 100%. Well, Luke absolutely put this in his special material. I actually gave more of a theory, like this is what I believe happened. I'm not saying it's true. It just makes sense based on some of the syntax as well as some of the Lucanisms that are in there. And it's more of a theory, but I agree that there has to be a criteria. But the question, Nick, is when we look back into the first 400 years of the church, you're saying, well, the church has accepted this. Yeah, but not in the earliest portions of the church. Where is the evidence that they received this as John's writing? Not true. I agree with you that this story has been accepted as a true story. Papias mentioned it. I'm sure you'd recognize Jerome's citations of it, Augustine's citations, Eusebius' citations of it. I think people on my end have gotten foolish where they're pretending like it didn't happen or something. I actually agree it happened. My question is did John write it? And 5 of the best witnesses that we have to represent the first few hundred years of the church are 2 papyri that are dated in 175, late 2nd century. You have P75, P66. They do not have it in there. Then we have the 2 manuscripts you mentioned earlier, Aleph and B, that do not have it in there either, which are complete Gospels, 4th century, early 300s. But within that, we need to recognize that Sinaiticus, the first 8 chapters of Sinaiticus are not Alexandrian readings anyway. The first 8 chapters of John are Western, more so Western readings than Alexandrian. So we have the oldest witness there of the Western manuscripts that bring it in Sinaiticus, and it does not have it. And then we have one, I believe, the most important Byzantine manuscript that exists, and that's Codex A, Alexandrinus. Alexandrinus is Byzantine in the Gospels, but in the epistles, it's actually Alexandrian, which I believe is the most important witness of the Byzantine family, in my opinion. There's good Byzantine manuscripts, but I think it's one of the most important for the Gospels. It does have marks in there, but there's no notes. But in it, it does not have the story either. So the oldest witness of the Byzantine does not have it. The oldest witness of what would be considered a Western reading does not have it. The oldest witness of the Alexandrian and Vaticanus does not have it. And the oldest papyri do not have it either. The first introduction that we see to it in John's Gospel is a Western manuscript, which I'm sure you're familiar with, Codex D, Codex Beze, named after Theodore Beza. And I think you would agree, if you've examined that manuscript at all, it is not a reliable manuscript. And in that manuscript, these lectionaries that you're referring to, there are the asterisks there that even later on, Robinson, who I have tremendous respect for, Maurice Robinson is a tremendous scholar, love his work. I followed his work for years. He states that those asterisks were obviously placed later, and he links them to a 9th or 10th century lectionary. So we have one of the most unreliable manuscripts that introduces it. And then we have the previous manuscripts that I just listed do not have it. So yeah, we can talk about numbers, and I find it interesting, and we'll get into this more. You're vying for numbers here. Like, well, the most manuscripts, 85% of manuscripts have it, so it should be accepted. Then why can't you accept that in Revelation 16:5 when there's no manuscripts that have the reading? You're arguing numbers here, but you're not in the other passage, which we'll get to. But I don't see that consistent in your argument as well. But just because something has the canonical criteria doesn't mean it has to be automatically accepted as inspiration.
Yeah, we'll hit Revelation. Let's let Nick respond to that.
Okay. So I can respond to the Pericope Adulterae issues there. Cool. And so just a few things, like there are conjectures in the critical text, like say in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 10, that basically say the opposite thing to all the Greek manuscripts. And so it's a bit like the pot calling the kettle black when critical text advocates hold TR and King James people accountable for having a conjectural imitation in Revelation 16:5 when they do it themselves. And in something that completely changes the meaning from something, it's actually the word not. And so if you, Jeff Riddle's written quite a lot about that, and so I'd recommend that you look that up. Concerning P75, P66, and even Alexandrinus, we're not sure what's on the last page of those 3 documents, in a sense where Actually, I should rephrase that. P75 and P76, we don't know what's on the last page. That the Pericope Adulterae could have been moved to the end of that book. We just don't have the last page of both of those manuscripts. And so we know that the early church fathers, yes, they mention it, but it's what they say about it, that it's in many Greek copies and many Latin copies. So that's mentioned early. And we also look at the capitula, the Latin capitula, which basically says that the Pericope Adulterae was there in the probably about 250. And so when we put the writings of the early church fathers together and we examine what they were saying about it, they were saying it's around, it's here. But then we're only dealing with fragmentary pieces of information from one location just because of the weather. Because it was dry in Egypt, we're like, okay, we're going to favor these manuscripts. Everywhere else, there was lots of rain, lots of mold, lots of, problems and issues, and manuscripts faded away. And so we're only dealing with a small amount of manuscripts in a small location. And so, just one more thing, just regarding Revelation 16:5 being based upon no manuscripts. I believe that once someone understands the Triadic Declaration, that it is an expansion of the name of Jehovah, that it is a noun phrase, that actually all the manuscripts say the one who was and is and shall be. All the manuscripts say that. A bit like if you were reading through, say, Matthew chapter 1, it might say the name Jesus in a nomina sacra form. And so you don't say, oh, it doesn't say Jesus. You say, no, it says Jesus. It's just only 2 letters are involved. Once you understand that this is a noun phrase, that it is the most holy name in the whole entire New Testament, then you can understand why they put holy upon it and why that is a form of nomina sacra, but usually that's a form in the Old Testament.
Well, let me say this, Nick, about 2 Peter 3:10. I don't agree with the reading in the Nestle-Aland 28th edition. In fact, there's a lot of guys on the critical text side, like Elijah Hickson and others, who have taken issue with the insertion that you're talking about because it's primarily based on a Coptic manuscript that's very old. But not everybody in the critical text position. In fact, what you're stating is actually from the Nestle-Aland 28th edition. But if you look at the Tyndale House text, like where Elijah works in England, it does not have that reading as the Nestle-Aland 28th. So there are critical text people that do not agree with 2 Peter 3:10 and the reading that's there. I understand why they did it, just like I understand why Beza did what he did, but I don't agree with it. So just to be clear, I don't agree with the reading in the Nestle-Aland 28th and 2 Peter 3. Also, you talk about many copies. I'm assuming you're referring to Jerome's statement. With that being said, were you referring to what Jerome said? He said there were many copies. Okay, well, let me ask you this.
Many Greek and Latin, yeah.
Yeah. Would you agree then with his statement when he got to the portion of the long ending of Mark where he said almost none of the manuscripts had the long ending of Mark? If we're going to be consistent with Jerome's quote, you would have to accept the Pericope Adulterae on his statement because he said many have the PA, but he also said, along with Eusebius, almost none of the ones that he had in the West, Eusebius had in the East, had the long ending of Mark. So you would have to reject the long ending of Mark and accept the Pericope of Jerome's statement, which I would actually say there's far more evidence for the long ending of Mark than there is for the Pericope. So I think when we quote those guys, they can't be our final decision. We need to take heed to what they say. But if we go off of Jerome's statement, we have to accept the PA and reject the long ending of Mark. Also, the oldest witness of the story of the woman caught in adultery is actually not a manuscript witness. It's a quote of Eusebius from a church father named Papias, which I'm sure you're familiar with. He quotes him in his history of the church. What Papias said is astonishing because Papias knew or possibly knew of the apostle John himself, if not John through Polycarp or one of the disciples. When he was citing, Eusebius was citing Papias, he was going through primarily actually Matthew's gospel in that section, and that he actually said Matthew was written originally in Hebrew, according to Papias, not even in Greek. And then he was explaining that there were citations from Papias of the first epistle of John, and also Peter, First Peter. And then he makes this additional, and there were some other statements, and then he quotes Papias on, there was a story of this woman caught in many sins, which is interesting. Adultery is not mentioned. Brought before the Lord as found in the gospel of the Hebrews. Now, if Papias knew John, or knew of John very closely within a couple of years, and he knew that was in John's gospel, Papias had no problem writing about John's gospel and other places. Why in the world would he leave the most important gospel that he would have been most familiar with between Luke, Matthew, and Mark, and go off to a gospel that was primarily read by Jewish Christians in Egypt? The gospel of the Hebrews was more of a gospel for the Christians in Egypt. He was closer to where John was in Ephesus, and yet he's quoting it from a gospel that primarily made its way into Egypt, not John's own gospel. So our first century witness of the Pericope does not credit this story to John. He credits it to the gospel of the Hebrews. To me, that is telling. And Eusebius didn't even comment on it. He just kind of let it go. Because if Eusebius knew about it, why didn't Eusebius also chime in and say, kind of like the way John has it, it's a lesser. And what I proved in my mind the best I could, that it seems the most logical explanation is you have a partial story from Papias and a very full story from Didascalia, a Syrian writing that has one half of the story, or really 3/4 of the story, mixed with 3/4 or 1/4 of the story, and it kind of conflated into one with a few additives. Even Maurice Robinson recognized that there is no majority. You're saying, well, there's over 1,000 manuscripts that support it, 85%. But even Maurice Robinson broke that statistic down for us. And he used von Soden's work, who said there's 7 different stream readings in this one story. That is incredible. That can't be said about any other passage. Maurice Robinson condensed it to 3 with the letter mu in Greek, M5, M6, M7. In fact, if you pull up a Pierpont and Robinson majority text, he actually gives you the M6, M7, M5 all through the readings to show you where the streams are. So it's really more like 31%, I think 27 and 29. It's really not as majority as everybody wants to make it out to be. It is in the majority of Byzantine manuscripts, but not even the Byzantine streams can agree on wording. And I showed and demonstrated there are places that are not Johannine at all. There's words in the Greek that John used that he does not use in 1 John, 2 John, 3 John, or Revelation, or in the rest of the gospel, that are not his language, especially when Jesus was writing on the ground. And that you can actually find more Lucan terms in that than you can anywhere else. And the lectionaries, and I want to ask you this, you're mentioning the lectionaries in the asterisks, which, by the way, I think they're very important. I think they're very, very important. In fact, the book To Cast the First Stone by Nust and Wasserman did an excellent job of explaining that. But they also concluded that that no decision should be made on this passage on the basis of lectionaries. They concluded that, and they did a thorough job. They even stated at the end that their position is that this was inserted later. And you'd have to admit, Nick, that lectionaries was a Byzantine tradition that started in Constantinople. That wasn't something that's been going on from the beginning of time. And the oldest lectionaries that we have are 4th century at best, late 4th century, and they're fragmented. And the first ones that really actually have the story in it really are not even complete or partial. And you stated it's out of place for them to read it. You compared it to a Christmas story. Like, well, they would skip over it because who wants to interrupt the Christmas story with a woman caught in adultery? That's my point. That story's out of place. It interrupts a thought. It's not following a train of thought. John's statement was interrupted by this story. And we're saying, well, the lectionaries are the explanation, but the lectionaries are a Byzantine tradition that came later. And
Stephen, let's give Nick a few minutes to respond to some of that, and then we're going to have to transition over to Revelation. But sure. I'll give Nick a couple minutes to respond to some of that. Yeah, sorry to interrupt you there.
Yeah, because it's getting a little bit long, and so actually even just trying to remember what was first said is becoming difficult. But so to say, I've got to basically accept what Jerome said about Mark. Well, this is one of the things that I disagree with a lot of critical text folks and their scholarship, is say even Elijah Hickson recently did an article on 1 John 5:7, and he looked at just the Greek manuscripts, and that's fine, and TR King James people will say, yeah, there's slim amount of Greek evidence for that in the manuscripts. But when we look at the early church writings, when we look at the Latin, so the three closed class of witnesses, we see there it's in pretty much 95 to 98% of the Latin. So it's so well attested in the Latin that, but that just never gets mentioned. And this is one of the things which, say, the Jerome comment about the last 12 verses of Mark, I personally would say, okay, well, Jerome, perhaps that was his experience, but it's abnormal compared to what we're seeing. And so in a sense where I don't think that Jerome was lying about that, but at the end of the day, Jerome did put in those 12 verses into his edition. And so he believed that they were authentic. And so I believe that speaks volumes there. When he does say it's in the Greek and it's in the Latin, they're just things that we look at and we examine as part of the evidence, not just something that just completely overrides all the other evidence. We've got to weigh all the evidence. And this is one of the things which, like say on the issue of the Comma Johanneum, we've got to look at everything. We're people are just like the Greek. When you look at Erasmus, he did a Latin translation and then he did a Greek translation. He was an expert in Latin. He was an expert in Greek. All the Textus Receptus major editions during around the time of the King James translators were usually diglots. Erasmus's one was, Beza's one was. And so you had the Greek on one side and the Latin on the other, and they were looking at Latin, they were looking at Greek, and they were looking at all the evidence. And so when it comes to the vocabulary, I just look at, say, Zane Hodges and Arthur Farstead in 1982. They wrote in their book, The Greek New Testament According to the Majority Text, basically that they, from their scholarly perspective, John wrote it. And so I understand that in your article you've gone in depth. You've got you got a lot of Greek words showing that they're from Luke, showing that they're from other places. And to me, it's like I haven't had the time to actually go through and check every one of them.
Sure.
But if I was just to appeal to scholarship, and if I was to look at these guys who are not King James guys, these are just scholars, and I don't think the majority text guys have a huge barrow to push. They would pretty much go either way, whichever way the evidence points. Even though I believe that they're flawed in their methodology, they clearly state that there's no compelling reason to doubt that the story is originally Johannine, despite the prevailing contrary opinion. And then they have many, many examples in that book about why John wrote it. And so I guess in a way to go through the vocabulary, that there's people on both sides saying
absolutely
very convincing things. And to me,
absolutely,
that's just to me, the main issue is the lectern cycle. So now you were saying that the story was sort of like interrupted. And so, we got Jesus, his teaching, then there's this woman adultery story. I think we do see that quite a lot in the Gospels. We see like the woman with the issue of blood. We might be talking about that and we don't really want to talk about that particular issue on a certain day. And so the lectern guys, they were like, okay, move this, read this later. But what we see, one of the reasons why we believe it is part of the lectern cycle is because of where it was moved to. And so it was moved to the reading for October the 8th, if I recall correctly, which is the day where they talk about the woman caught in adultery in the lectern cycle. And so that's why in some manuscripts it's found at Luke. Other times it's found in John chapter 7, verse 36, which is actually at the beginning of the 86th portion of the lectionary. So people were told to put it back in the 86th section, and they were putting it right back at the beginning of the section or right at the end of the section. And so you can see they were trying to put it back into that section. And so to me, that speaks of the lectionary cycle. I guess in a way, because the Pericope Adulterae is your main topic, you've written an article on it, and I'm trying to debunk you. I have leaned heavily upon James Snapp's argument.
Sure.
And I would encourage anyone to read his book, which I think I have a picture of it on the screen here.
Got about 1 more minute, Nick.
A fresh analysis, I don't know if that's backwards or forwards, or if you can even see it, a fresh analysis of John 7:53 to 8:11. And so James Snapp basically goes through every single thing you can imagine about this issue. And I believe that once that book is read and understood, that we can't really get around the lectern cycle. So I mightn't be explaining it properly because as I mentioned earlier, most of my focus is on TR, King James issues and all the rest of it. But this issue, when I read Snapp's material, I was thoroughly convinced, and I believe that that's the way that people should go in their scholarship.
David, can I ask 2 quick questions of him?
Yeah.
Yeah, you can hit him with 2. We're going to have a kind of a short discussion on Revelation.
Really
but yeah, go ahead.
By the way, Snapp does a great job. I actually like Snapp's arguments I actually learned a little bit from reading him on the asterisks, a lot more thorough. And he would admit not every one of the asterisks represents that. But here's my question. To Cast the First Stone by Nust and Wasserman, they did an explanation. They pointed to the fact that they're an important factor, but no decision on the story should be made off of the lectionaries. Do you agree or disagree with them?
I totally disagree. I believe that in the conference that they had in 2014, it was clear that Maurice Robinson presented basically the James Snapp type argument.
Sure.
And it was very convincing. Now, I believe that Wasserman and Nust, I believe that their book is not thorough. I believe it's a popular book written mostly just for sales. I don't believe it's as thorough as something like James Snapp's written. I think James Snapp has written several articles critiquing the book and critiquing the authors. And so I've had a little bit of conversation with Wasserman, but yeah.
Let me ask you with that. Since the lectionaries are no earlier than late 4th century, they're not any older that we have, any older than the Byzantine manuscripts that we have, because they started because of Constantinople. It was a tradition that started in Constantinople. It was a Byzantine tradition. With that being said, I recognize the importance of that, but they're still not the older manuscripts that don't represent, like I said, P75, P66, Aleph, B, or even the oldest Byzantine manuscript like Codex A. Since those are no older than those kind of manuscripts, they don't represent the first couple hundred years of the reading. So though I think they're important, I don't think they prove that the stories are original because of the patristic quotations of it being in the Gospel of the Hebrews rather than John, or that it's in Gospels like Didymus the Blind, stuff like that. I would reject it because they're no older than the late 4th century. That's just my position. I know we don't disagree. We need to move on to Revelation.
So yeah, and
can I just quickly answer that, just so we tidy that up?
Sure. You can do that, Nick. And then also we wanted a little bit. Could you explain like the cycle just a little bit about, like, for the dummies in the audience like me, explain exactly what that is, and then you can answer that, of course, and then we'll move on to Revelation. So
basically, every year they read through certain feast days, and so they didn't read through the whole entire New Testament. They just read certain passages on certain days. It's a bit like we might do at Easter, or say we read about the wise man and all that. We might read Matthew chapter 2, and then we just flip over to Luke. And so these marks were put there to go, okay, now flip over to this story or that story. And so just like the woman the woman with the issue of blood, you might be reading through that and go, look, I don't really want to bring that up in this context. And so marks were put next to that, and early lecture marks were put into early manuscripts. And so that's just what I want to actually touch on right here, right now, that Dean John William Burgon, I'll just read a quote of his. It won't be one sec. I just had it up here. In the Dublin Review, speaking of Dean Burgon in 1872, they wrote, quote, Mr. Burgon indeed seems to assert that whenever a manuscript contains an admitted error, you are warranted in suspecting, in default or other explanation, that the lectionary system has been to blame, especially if the error is an omission. So what they're basically, they're summarising Dean Burgon saying, well, he's always just saying that it's because of the lectionaries. That's why things are omitted, because people read the marginal notes wrong and went, okay, well, apparently we've got to leave this out, instead of just skipping over it in the lecton reading. So a lecton is basically just a type of preaching. And so I'll read James Snap, and this is the last quote I'll make on this. But he summarises it. And this is in his book, The Fresh Analysis. So that's this one here. In the case at hand, I submit the following hypothesis. John 7:53 to 8:11 was in an exemplar used by copyists in Egypt in the mid-100s, having descended to it from an autograph. So they basically received the autograph in Egypt of the Gospels. By the mid-100s, the churches in Egypt already possessed a rudimentary lection cycle for their major annual festivals, Easter, Pentecost, Christmas, Annunciation Day, and Palm Sunday. Regarding the Gospels selection, assigned to be read on Sundays, the text critic Caspar René Gregory stated, it seems to me likely that an extremely early date the lessons were chosen for the Sundays. John Chrysostom in the late 300s refers to the assignment of specific passages for specific Sundays to be something established by previous generations. His contemporaries Epiphanius and Augustine likewise indicate their familiarity with reading cycles used in the churches. And of course, we see in the book of Acts, the Christian church observed the annual feast of Pentecost from its very beginning. And so basically what Snap's saying here is that it wasn't the full lecton cycle that came later, but this is just an early lecton cycle to do with certain feast days. And so it was the beginning, I guess the puppy feet of the later.
But the evidence of the woman caught in adultery cannot be traced any earlier than 5th, maybe later century. But that's again, I know we got to move on, but I would say the evidence does not prove that. David, take us out.
No, I think I hear both of your points there, and I do appreciate it, and I'd love to let you keep battling that out. But yes, we do need to move on to Revelation here. Because we let Nick lead on that one, and we've got about maybe 6-7 minutes to discuss this, so this is going to be a lot briefer. But Stephen,
I hope we can extend this. Nick, you state often that there's 20 translatable differences between the King James Version's choices of Beza over Stephanus. Is that correct?
Yes, approximately.
Scrivener said there's 59, so I'm curious to where you got the number 20.
Scrivener says there's 190, actually.
No, I'm talking about the translatable ones. I'm talking about translatable.
Translatable. Okay. Oh, that's interesting because I get my statistics. I'm actually slowly going through every time Scrivener mentions a change. And so that's on my website. If you type in 191 into the search bar, you'll find that article. But that's from the scholarship of D.A. Waite and also Kirk DeVitro. So I know Kirk's son is part of the King James only debate group, I think. So he might even have that article. And so they both came to the 20 number. So that's why I say around 20 translatable things.
I actually went through all 59. I actually got it right here. And after
I'd love to read it.
I transmitted and translated all 59. I actually found 60 in doing it. And One of them, Scrivener miscited, the very last one. And then Timothy Berg came behind me and edited it. I'd love to send that to you. I actually got a different statistic, and I even color coordinated and everything. I've got 49 translatable differences with 11 that should not be listed in that list. But I'll send that to you afterward. I was just really curious. Also, let's talk about this. You've mentioned in the past, and this hasn't come up, but I want you to speak on this. And I know, David, if you could please, by grace, extend some time on this. You've mentioned in the past that there's Ethiopic support outside of the Greek text. Because earlier you mentioned, well, not everything's about the Greek. Well, I hope you give that same latitude to the Nestle and all in 28. But I agree with you, but I think there should be Greek. You've made statements about the Ethiopic or the Ge'ez language supporting this from the 1549. And you wrote that in your book, and I think you took a picture of Hoskier's citation. Is that correct?
Yeah, and Walton's polyglot.
Right. I'm going to actually pull that up for us, Nick. I'm going to try to share a screen once again. I might fail really badly, but I'm going to do that. Let's see how this goes. Y'all tell me if you can see it.
Yep.
All right. It's based on this statement up here, correct, Nick?
Yes.
Okay. Now, let me just say this, and you can chime in on this. This is a translation of the Ethiopic and the polyglot of Walton, correct?
Yes.
All right. And the man's name that did the translating and transmitting was Dudley Loftus. He was an Irishman who did the Ge'ez language. And in a book called The Memoirs of the Life and Writings of Reverend Brian Walton, which is the polyglot, a man did this and said this about his work of Ethiopic transmitting and translating. He said the translator of it in the Latin conjectured, and he gives the word there, and he states how inconsistent this is, and basically says the Ethiopic translator must be illiterate and the translation novel when it comes to, and he compares the Syriac. And then Scrivener, who I know you appreciate a lot of Scrivener's work, and I do as well, said this about the translation as well. Walton's polyglot, the New Testament, was reprinted with many faults. An unusually bad Latin translation by Dudley Loftus, from which Mill and his successors derive various readings. So what I did is I got so tired of reading how bad the Latin was, I ended up going to find out from, I have a connection at the Smithsonian who connected me with one of the leading professionals in the world in the Ge'ez language, Dr. Notsnitzen, and I hope I just did justice to his name because I don't know how to pronounce German names. And what he did for me, Nick, and I'll pull this up for us, is he translated the Ethiopic out of the polyglot itself. And what you said was true. In one place, in your argument, you say that who will be is there in the Ethiopic. You are correct about that. I'd like to state this. He made statements that these transmissions into the Ethiopic were very poorly done, a lot of misspellings and so forth. But I noticed that there was something missing even in the Ethiopic that was translated in the Latin. There is who is and who will be, but there is no who was. The Tridact declaration's not even in the Ethiopic. And it's not based on anything like what we're suggesting Beza said about Jehovah. In fact, the word over here is actually God. Though it is a sacred name, Theos would be a sacred name, it is not Jehovah name on Korea. So even in the Ethiopic translation here. So what happened and I want you to chime in on this, Nick, I'll give you a lot of time to explain. You come down here into Hoskier's edition of citations. And by the way, all the support says Hosios right here. Here's all the support. Here's the translation of Dudley. You are righteous. And then he has Lord here. He mistranslated the Ethiopic. Should have been God. And rectus right here. And then you're right about this part. This right here, Dick shows that this is the Ethiopic in the polyglot. You're right about this right here in your book. That is to be. But what I find interesting down here is Hoskier waited till he got to Kai Ha Hosios and the Holy One. And he cites one of the over here. This is a Coptic manuscript. And then he cites again back up here our polyglot, rectus pro sanctus ut supra. And he's letting us know that rectus replaced or went in place of sanctus, which is Holy One, ut supra. But Hoskier's saying that actually the polyglot supports kai ha hasios, and that the word Holy One has been replaced with a different word, rectus, here. And that's understandable because if we go back to our Ethiopic over here, for some reason we have in transmission righteous and just, which doesn't really make sense to have both there. And so Dudley translated it to rectus instead of sanctus, and Hoskier recognized this should have been this is a replacement for the word Holy One, basically. And so he's saying that actually the polyglot supports hasios. So really, according to this, the Ethiopic reads the one who is and is to be the Holy One. That's actually the reading in the Ethiopic. I'd love your feedback on that, Nick.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I'm actually really glad that you're doing this type of research, because this is one of the reasons why I wrote the article, was because I'm obviously, I don't have any scholarly credentials. I'm just a layman. I'm actually just a rookie guy just trying to, show some truths. And so when I wrote the book on Revelation 16:5, a lot of it I was pioneering certain ground and saying things that no one else was saying, and I was trying to soundboard off many people, including Jeff Riddle, and no one would really sort of touch the issue, because even a lot of TR guys are a bit like, we're not sure about this whole thing. And so with the Ethiopic, what I found was in a lot of the early church writings and in other versions, because it's a noun phrase, sometimes you'll have the one who was and is to come. Sometimes you have the one who was and is to come. In the Arabic, it just says the eternal, which is sort of like I am. It's like the eternal one. It's like, and so that's why I guess I put all that information in the book. Or one of the main reasons I put the information in the book was to refute James White's claim about it. But the secondary thing was so that people can look at the evidence and I guess use that as use my ceiling as a platform to go, oh, hang on, Nick, this is wrong, this is right. And so I had the guy from the Trinitarian Bible Society contact the other day through email, and he was agreeing with Jeff Riddle that the common, I think you put it on your screen earlier, the common Latin of Beza that basically speaks about this manuscript and how he restored it, that it has been mistranslated. And so I'm open to all those things. And so I guess because I've sort of pioneered a bit of a work, people then are saying, well, what about this and what about that? And I actually invite all that. Yeah. And in a sense where I've probably said in the past, the Ethiopic has the Triadic Declaration, but then I probably should be a little bit more careful and say, well, the Ethiopic has the final part of the Triadic Declaration shall be, which is usually the one that everyone's arguing about. And so, but I really appreciate your study on that.
Would you admit that any place even in the Greek in chapter 1 or chapter 4, by the way, it's also a textual variant in chapter 11, is to be or is to come, erkomenos. There's only 5 late manuscripts that even support it there. And one of the biggest reasons that Beza made the change was he was saying, well, the reigning began actually in chapter 16. This is like the climactic moment where he's given his rights as judge. But actually that hermeneutically, I would disagree with Beza. Actually in chapter 11, it says that right afterward, if you read it in the critical text, it says who is and who was, and then it goes into this statement about he has taken his great power. The word taken is actually a perfect active. So he already took the power. He already took the sovereign control and rule. And it says, and begun to reign, which is an aorist active. So it's pinpointed in time. And that pinpointed time continued an action from it. So you have a completed action and a beginning action, all moving through the tradition. Jesus actually began this control, judgment, reign in chapter 11. So it makes no sense in chapter 16 to refer to Jesus as the one who is still to be and come, when he already began that in chapter 11. So I not only think he was wrong in the harmonization, I actually think Beza was wrong in his hermeneutics. Based on what he said he is seated on the tribunal and arrives at the decree of judgment at the very end of his annotations in 1582. But what I would say to that is I don't see, and you're saying, well, Hasios was put over Asamenos. That would have been the original reading. We know, and I know you know this, there's no manuscript that shows that. But not only that, it's not showing it in chapter 16. It doesn't show that in chapter 11 in any manuscript. It doesn't show that in chapter 1. It doesn't show that in chapter 4, verse 8. So I struggle to see as, well, they got replaced, when there would be some evidence there. Like I look at the nomina sacra mix up in 1 Timothy 3:16. You have theos and hos, and now you have he versus God, and the difference is one little line. And so we say, okay, well, we can see where the manuscripts, one side either went this way and that way. Now we have two streams of manuscripts doing this because of one little line. But we don't even see an evidence of that in the Greek in a place like here. So I understand the nomina sacra can be misunderstood and even confused. It is in 1 Timothy 3:16. Did God become or did he become? Either way, I still think you can prove the deity there without it. But still, how come we don't have that in Revelation 16:5? Those are questions that come into my mind. Maybe you can give me some feedback on that.
I'm going to let Nick respond to that, and then we'll probably give you both about a minute after that to just kind of give your final thoughts, and we're going to wrap
We
this up,
appreciate your grace, David. We appreciate your grace.
No problem. I've enjoyed it. Go ahead, Nick.
And so, 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 16, where it's that theos is changed to os. So this is one of the things about looking at all the evidence, all the early church writings, all the versions, absolutely everything, then making a conclusion instead of just looking at the Greek and primarily just looking at, say, Vaticanus or Sinaiticus. That's usually what happens. And so when we look at that, just the basic grammar, it has a predicate without a subject. And so that's probably the biggest grammatical blunder in the entire critical text, in the entire New Testament, is that who appeared in a body, even to the point where Hort, he actually made up a theory that it was a song that Paul was, going along, and then he just broke out into a song. He appeared in a body, and he sang it because it's in strophes. Even in the New King James, they have the reading God or theos, but it's in strophes. It's like a psalm. And this comes directly from Hort. And this is the sort of reasoning behind it. There's no evidence, absolutely none, for a song. And when you look at the latest type of dating that they have and the ability to read manuscripts under ultraviolet light and things like that, they have proven that the Nestle Aland 27th edition had 6 false citations about theos. And so these are things that have got to be taken into consideration. But just back on Revelation 16:5, the same thing, we've got to look at all the evidence. It doesn't explain how it ended up in the editions of Beatus of Libana or Jaime. I won't mention his last name. It's a big German last name, Halberdistensis. And so how it ended up, the Triadic Declaration ends up there. How Clement of Alexandria quotes pretty much exactly what Beza has. And some of these guys, they might quote the first part and the last part and leave out the middle, but they relate it to the name of the Tetragrammaton. So it doesn't explain the other evidence that basically is just like the King James or the TR. We see that there are a massive amount of manuscripts. So I've just lost one page here that I was going to. There's a massive amount of manuscripts that, or Latin manuscripts, early church writings and things like that, that have the TR King James phraseology. How did it end up in those? Did they all just come to the same conclusion as Beza? We've basically got to go through each one of them individually and say, well, how did they come up with that reading? And that's not explained by many people. And so I understand what you're saying about Revelation chapter 11, verse 17. Most of the time, people will just copy what Bruce Metzger says there, and it's actually his own eschatology there that does affect that reading and why he's said certain things about it. I believe Beza was correct to say that because the very next thing after Revelation 16:5, we basically see 2 chapters the woman that rides the beast and Babylon the Great and things like that, and then it's the second coming. So it's sort of like this little interlude and then the second coming, and so that's why I believe that Beza was correct there. I guess then it comes down to an understanding of Revelation chapter 11 and having good eschatology, understanding it from a biblical perspective. And so, but just one thing I just sort of throw in here. There is a psalm that reads almost identically to Revelation 16:5 in Psalm 119. I've been trying to look for it the whole debate here, but it basically has the word Lord in it, and so it says like, "You are righteous, O Lord," and it's almost exactly like the angel quotes it. And so this is one of the other evidences for Kurios being put into Revelation 16:5 there.
All right, so Nick, just take like 30 seconds to a minute. Just give us your closing thoughts, and then immediately after that, Stephen, you can give your 30 seconds to a minute final thoughts.
Sure.
So I would encourage anyone who's watching to, firstly on the PA, to read James Snap's material on it and Maurice Robinson, and to come to conclusions from weighing all that evidence. On the issue of Revelation 16:5, I would encourage people to read through what I've written carefully, because and also to have a look at Beza's footnote at Revelation chapter 1 verse 4, where he mentions that the Triad Declaration is a form of nomina sacra. And so I'm not a Latin expert. I have hardly any skill in Latin, but it's almost like a plea to people to translate that and to look at these things and to show exactly what Beza is saying there, because we can figure out certain things, but we want to be accurate on this. We want truth, and we don't want to be deceived. And so, thanks, guys.
Hey, so I just want to be clear too, and I hope Nick recognizes, I know he mentioned Aleph and B and things I hope you see that I can go farther than Aleph and B. I'm not stuck to those two manuscripts. I've cited numerous. Looking at, how do you explain it got there? Well, I'm actually shocked that more manuscripts didn't try to harmonize for the same reason that Beza did. I'm shocked we didn't have more harmonization going on in that passage. And a lot of the church fathers could have just as much been quoting chapter 1 or chapter 4 in their citations. They don't always specifically say where that quote came from. And Nick, I do appreciate your spirit in this. I appreciate your work. I'm glad you're updating some of the King James readings. I'm glad you're not stuck to like, oh, this is the only one, it can't be touched mentality. I think you're doing a good job. You're helping other people get a translation in a different language you mentioned earlier as well. I'm thankful for that. And I would encourage anybody to read Nick's work on the Nomina Sacra. Like I said, Nick, I think it's one of the best I've ever read. I appreciate the amount of time I know you put time into that to explain how it made it into the Hebrew manuscripts as well as the Greek. I would encourage anybody to read your work on that. I think you did a tremendous job. I would encourage anybody to read my article on the woman caught in adultery as well. You don't have to agree with me, and I said that at the end. At the end of the day, we're supposed to greet each other as saints, as Philippians 4 instructs us to do. We're going to spend eternity together, so we need to learn to disagree the right way, even in these passages. Nick, following the text of Scripture he believes is the perfect or the right one, is going to bring him to right theology. Following the critical text, in my opinion, as well, will bring you to the right theology on every cardinal doctrine. We can have unity in the gospel. Nick, I appreciate your time coming out and having this discussion with me.
Thanks for the invite.
Thanks so much, both of you, for coming on. Russell?
Yeah, it was great, guys. I mean, I enjoyed it thoroughly. Again, thank you guys for coming on. I hope to see you guys in the future. Maybe we can have you on another episode for round 2. But
Anytime.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Well, that concludes today's podcast, guys. Thanks for listening, and we're out of here.
Thanks.